It was the kind of night that swallowed sound. On January 12, 2004, the town of Ashford, Maine, lay silent under a heavy quilt of snow. The storm had rolled in during the afternoon, smothering streets and houses with white, coating every tree branch, every rooftop. By evening, visibility had dropped so low that the few people still outside spoke of walking through a blur, as though the town had been erased and redrawn in pale chalk. Most residents had retreated indoors, turning up heaters, locking their doors, and settling in for the long night. At 9:42 p.m., Rachel Morgan sent what would become her last message. "I'm home now, let's talk tomorrow," she typed to her best friend, Emily. She had returned from a shift at the small pharmacy where she worked part-time while studying nursing at the University of Southern Maine. Her friend later recalled that Rachel had sounded tired but cheerful, relieved to be back inside where it was warm. Nothing in her words suggested what would unfold in the hours that followed. Rachel lived in a small two-bedroom apartment she shared with her boyfriend, who that night was working a double shift at the paper mill on the edge of town. Neighbors saw her enter the building, bundled in her thick winter coat, balancing her bag on one shoulder. A woman across the hall remembered hearing the sound of her key turning in the lock and the muffled click of the deadbolt sliding into place. Everything seemed ordinary. But by morning, nothing would be ordinary again. The first sign that something was wrong came just after 8 a.m. the next day, when Rachel's landlord tried to deliver a maintenance notice. He knocked, waited, and then slid the paper under her door. Hours later, Rachel's mother called the apartment repeatedly, growing anxious when her daughter didn't pick up. It was unlike Rachel to ignore calls, especially when she had promised to phone home after her late shift. By 6 p.m., worry had hardened into panic. Her mother drove through the still icy streets to the apartment complex, a beige three-story building with peeling paint and a parking lot piled high with snow from the plows. Rachel's car was still there, its windshield buried, untouched since the storm. Inside the apartment, the chain lock was fastened. Police who responded had to force the door. What they found was the first layer of a puzzle that would torment them for years. The apartment looked almost staged in its ordinariness. A plate sat on the table, dinner half finished, roast chicken, vegetables, a glass of water beside it. Rachel's coat hung neatly by the door, her wallet and keys on the counter, her phone plugged into its charger. In the bedroom, the bed was turned down as though ready for sleep. There were no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no smeared footprints. Only absence. The officers searched for any sign of how she could have left. The front door was bolted from the inside. Windows were locked. The back door, leading to a narrow stairwell, was secured as well. Outside, the snow was pristine, unbroken by footprints leading in or out. The storm, in effect, had frozen the scene in time, capturing every disturbance, yet there were none. To investigators, it was a paradox. How could a woman vanish from a sealed apartment in the middle of a snowstorm without leaving the slightest trace? Rachel's friends and family flooded the building that evening, standing in shocked silence as police moved in and out. Emily, the friend who had received Rachel's last text, sobbed as she told officers she was fine. She was home. How could she just be gone? Theories bloomed almost instantly. Some whispered that she must have left voluntarily, slipping out at night through a route the police hadn't noticed. Others, darker in nature, suggested that someone had been inside with her, that Rachel had unknowingly locked herself in with her abductor. But if that were true, where were the signs of a struggle? And how had the perpetrator left? For days, search parties combed Ashford. Volunteers trudged through knee-deep snow, scanning wooded areas, abandoned sheds, frozen riverbanks. Flyers with Rachel's smiling face, long brown hair, bright eyes, were tacked onto telephone poles and taped to store windows. The community wanted to believe she would be found quickly. Yet the investigation was already bogged down by the locked room mystery. Detectives worked through every possible explanation: a hidden passage, a forgotten spare key, a staged disappearance. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny. The vents were checked, the roof inspected, every neighbor questioned. No one had heard or seen anything unusual. The snow remained unbroken. The case file grew heavier by the day. Officers documented every minor detail: the position of the dinner plate, the level of water in the glass, the charge on Rachel's phone, even the way the curtains were drawn. But nothing led to Rachel herself. Meanwhile, her family lived in suspended torment. Her mother appeared on local news stations, pleading for information. Her father drove the highways for miles in every direction, searching ditches and abandoned lots. Emily, racked with guilt, replayed the last text over and over, wondering if there had been some hidden message she had missed. The town itself began to change. Ashford, once a place where people left doors unlocked, grew paranoid. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. At the diner, conversations hushed when the subject of Rachel came up. Parents kept their children indoors. The idea that someone could disappear from within their own locked home felt like a violation of the town's very sense of safety. And then there were the rumors. Some claimed Rachel had staged her own vanishing, running away to escape pressures unknown. Others insisted it was supernatural, that no human explanation could account for the locked apartment and the untouched snow. But the truth, as investigators would one day uncover, was far more disturbing, because it relied not on fantasy, but on calculation. For 17 years, the disappearance of Rachel Morgan remained an unsolved riddle. The locked room, the snow, the silence, each piece was maddening in its perfection. The police could only preserve the evidence, photograph the scene, and wait for advances in science or a slip of conscience to reveal what had happened. But on that first night, as detectives walked through the small, dimly lit apartment, all they had was absence. No body, no suspect, no explanation. Just the echo of a young woman's life interrupted mid-sentence. And it all began with one simple, ordinary message: "I'm home now, let's talk tomorrow." In the winter of 2004, as search parties combed through the snowy outskirts of Ashford, one man watched quietly from his porch. His name was Daniel Whitaker. To his neighbors, he was unremarkable, just another middle-aged man who had lived in town his whole life, a heating and cooling technician people called when their furnace failed in January or when the humid summers became unbearable. His modest life made him invisible. Daniel lived only 3 blocks from Rachel Morgan's apartment, and on the night she vanished, his house was as silent as the snow-covered streets. Neighbors later recalled his work van parked in its usual spot, its logo faint beneath a layer of frost. Nothing suggested he was anything more than a reliable tradesman. But behind that ordinary face lay something darker. Daniel's childhood was marked by fear and silence. His father, a heavy drinker, was infamous for his temper, and shouts often echoed from the Whitaker home. His mother carried bruises she explained away as accidents. Growing up, Daniel learned that control equaled survival, and silence was safer than speaking. By his teenage years, he had already mastered how to disappear into the background. Teachers called him quiet, polite, and good with his hands. He spent hours dismantling radios, fixing broken fans, and patching wires. Machines were predictable. They obeyed commands, unlike people. But the need for control planted in that violent household stayed with him long after his father's death and long after he inherited the small home where he continued to live alone. By the time he reached his 40s, Daniel had perfected the mask of normalcy. He was the neighbor who helped shovel driveways, the repairman who never overcharged, the man who nodded politely in the grocery store. When Rachel Morgan's disappearance consumed Ashford, Daniel even joined the volunteer searches. He walked the snowy woods with a flashlight, calling her name with feigned concern. No one questioned his sincerity. Predators rarely look like predators, they look like helpers, like friends. Behind that mask, however, Daniel carried secrets. He knew how to bypass locks, how to move silently in the dark. Years of work in ventilation systems and crawlspaces had given him knowledge of the hidden world inside ordinary homes. Where others saw doors and windows as barriers, he saw weaknesses, unlatched access panels, forgotten vents, neglected covers no one thought twice about. On the night Rachel vanished, those skills became his weapon. Rachel never realized she was being watched. Daniel noticed her soon after she moved into her apartment on Pine Street. From his van, parked only a block away, he saw her carrying boxes inside. He learned her schedule before she even knew his name. He saw her return late from shifts, lights flickering on in her kitchen, laughter shared with her boyfriend on the stoop. To Daniel, she wasn't a neighbor but an obsession. Her independence, her easy laughter, her youthful confidence, all of it fascinated him. What began as curiosity hardened into fixation. He started timing his walks past her building, lingering in stores when she shopped, memorizing which nights her boyfriend worked late. Slowly, he reduced her from a person into an object of control. Predators rarely strike without rehearsal, and every moment Daniel spent shadowing her life was preparation. On January 12th, Ashford lay frozen under a blizzard. The streets were empty, the wind drowned every sound. For most, it was a night to stay inside. For Daniel, it was the chance he had been waiting for. Investigators would later reconstruct his steps. The vent cover in Rachel's basement had been loosened days earlier, unnoticed by anyone. That night, after she returned from her shift and sent a final text message, Daniel slipped into the shadows of her building. The snow muffled his approach, the storm hid his movements. He entered not through the door, but through the vent he had prepared, crawling into the apartment where Rachel, unaware, was heating her dinner. What happened next remained speculation for nearly 20 years. But one fact was undeniable: by morning, Rachel was gone, and the apartment was locked tight from within. Afterward, Daniel carried on with his life as if nothing had changed. He serviced furnaces, drank coffee in the diner, and greeted his neighbors as always. When police knocked on his door, he smiled politely and said he'd noticed nothing unusual. When the town held vigils, he lit candles and bowed his head. The case turned cold, but Daniel's secret endured. For 17 years he bore the weight of what he had done, shielded by the same mask he had worn since boyhood. Neighbors trusted him, clients paid him, and every day he walked past Rachel's old apartment without hesitation. What he did not realize was that traces remained, fibers, fragments, microscopic clues invisible to investigators in 2004 but destined to surface when technology advanced. Daniel Whitaker was never the monster people imagined in dark alleys. He didn't fit the face of menace. He was the man who fixed your heater, waved as you walked your dog, offered to help dig out your car after a storm. That was what made him dangerous. When, nearly 2 decades later, investigators named him a suspect, the town was stunned. Not Daniel, they whispered. He was always so helpful. But helpfulness was his disguise, control his addiction, and the disappearance of Rachel Morgan was the one act that revealed who he truly was. By the end of those years, Daniel remained free, his secret intact, still wearing the face of a kind neighbor. Yet beneath that mask, the storm of January 12th never passed. It lingered in the quiet streets of Ashford, waiting for the day when the truth would finally claw its way back into the light. When detectives first entered Rachel Morgan's apartment on Pine Street, the scene was one of quiet unease. Snow still clung to their boots as they crossed the threshold, stepping into a silence that felt unnatural. Nothing was overturned, no broken glass glittered on the floor, no signs of struggle disturbed the ordinary rhythm of the small 2-room flat. Yet Rachel, the 22-year-old nursing student, was nowhere to be found. The locked door behind them seemed to whisper the most troubling question: how could someone vanish from a sealed room? The investigation began with what was obvious. The door had been locked from the inside. Officers confirmed that the latch was engaged and that there was no damage to the lock, no forced entry marks on the frame. Both windows in the living room and bedroom were shut tight against the winter storm, their edges sealed with frost. From every angle, it appeared as if Rachel had stepped out of existence rather than walked away. On the kitchen counter, police found a half-eaten meal, a plastic container of leftovers she had likely reheated after her late shift. Her phone sat on the charger beside the table, screen dark but warm to the touch. Her wallet was inside her handbag, still resting on the chair by the door. It was as if she had paused her life mid-evening and simply never returned to it. Detectives interviewed the neighbors first. Most of them reported hearing nothing unusual. The storm that night had been fierce, its winds rattling windows and howling down the narrow streets of Ashford. One neighbor recalled hearing the faint sound of Rachel's television around 10 p.m., but nothing afterward. Another mentioned that the work van belonging to Daniel Whitaker, the heating technician from down the block, was parked in its usual place, already covered in a light layer of snow. No one remembered seeing Rachel leave. No one saw anyone enter. The puzzle of the locked apartment haunted the first weeks of the investigation. If Rachel had walked out willingly, she would have needed her coat, her wallet, and her phone. Yet all three remained inside. If someone had taken her, how did they leave without disturbing the locks or leaving tracks in the snow? Forensic teams combed the apartment. They dusted for fingerprints, swabbed for DNA, and photographed every corner. Nothing pointed to an intruder. Only one detail stood out. In the basement, a maintenance worker discovered that the vent cover near the furnace had been loosened. It wasn't broken, and it wasn't immediately suspicious until someone realized the vent was wide enough for a person to crawl through. The passage led to a narrow access tunnel that connected to the back alley, concealed beneath a snowdrift. At the time, this finding was not considered definitive. Investigators were cautious. It was possible Rachel herself had removed the cover for some reason. It was also possible that maintenance workers had left it unfastened weeks earlier. But in the absence of footprints, broken locks, or witnesses, the vent became the most plausible explanation for how someone could have entered or exited the sealed apartment. Police searched the surrounding area for evidence. In the alley, the storm had wiped clean any trace of movement. Fresh snow had buried the ground by midnight, covering whatever had occurred hours earlier. Dogs were brought in to track a scent, but the cold and wind scattered even that. The trail ended almost as soon as it began. Rachel's family pressed investigators for answers. Her parents traveled from their small town in Vermont to help with the search, standing in front of news cameras and begging anyone with information to come forward. Flyers with Rachel's smiling face, taken from a recent birthday party, were taped to lampposts and bulletin boards. For weeks, the town of Ashford joined together in vigils, search parties, and prayer circles. Yet every time the police returned to the apartment, they were met with the same unnerving question: how did she disappear without a trace? Some detectives considered more far-fetched theories. Could Rachel have staged her own disappearance? The idea seemed implausible. She had been saving money for her next semester of nursing school, had steady work at the local diner, and had made plans with friends for the following week. There were no signs of depression, no farewell letters, no withdrawals from her bank account. Others wondered if her boyfriend might be involved. He was the last known person to speak with her that night, though his alibi checked out. He had been working a late shift at the factory on the other side of town, verified by supervisors and coworkers. His grief appeared genuine, his cooperation with investigators complete. Still, suspicion lingered, as it often does when someone close to the victim is the last point of contact. For the forensic specialists, the most puzzling aspect remained the lack of disturbance. In cases of abduction or assault, there are usually traces, broken items, defensive wounds, blood, or at least signs of a struggle. Here there was nothing. The locked apartment seemed frozen in time, a tableau of ordinary life left unfinished. Months passed. Leads grew thin. The vent cover was photographed and noted, but without further evidence, it was little more than an oddity. Detectives filed their reports, volunteers dwindled, and media attention shifted to other stories. Rachel Morgan's case joined the grim category of cold cases, a term that concealed as much frustration as it did failure. Yet not everyone forgot. Some investigators revisited the files every year, hoping new technology might uncover what 2004 could not. Fibers collected from Rachel's jacket were sealed in evidence bags, as were trace materials from the vent shaft. At the time, they were too small, too contaminated to be of use. But science, they hoped, would advance. Meanwhile, the locked room aspect of the case became the subject of fascination. True crime enthusiasts debated it online. Amateur sleuths compared it to classic mysteries in literature, where a character disappears from a sealed chamber. Some speculated about paranormal involvement, though detectives dismissed those ideas outright. For law enforcement, the case was not about the supernatural but about human cunning, a predator who knew how to exploit the vulnerabilities of a home. The years of silence were hardest on Rachel's family. Each holiday came and went with an empty chair at the table. Each birthday passed with candles unlit. They clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, would break their silence. But the apartment on Pine Street remained locked in memory, the place where their daughter had last been seen. 17 years later, advances in forensic science would finally make sense of the evidence. The fibers on Rachel's jacket, once meaningless, revealed microscopic traces that matched uniforms worn by employees of Whitaker Heating and Air. The vent cover, photographed all those years earlier, fit a pattern of access points known to be used by someone who understood heating systems. Slowly, the locked room mystery unraveled, not into a tale of the impossible, but into the revelation of a man who had lived only 3 blocks away. At the heart of Part 3 lies the grim reminder that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The locked apartment was not impenetrable. It was vulnerable in ways most people never considered. And in those vulnerabilities, a man like Daniel Whitaker found his opportunity. Rachel Morgan did not vanish into thin air. She was taken through the hidden passageways of her own home by someone who had rehearsed every step. The locked door was not protection, it was camouflage, meant to deceive. For nearly 2 decades, it succeeded. But in the end, the truth was there all along, sealed inside the details investigators had gathered, waiting for the right tools to expose them. For 17 years, the mystery of Rachel Morgan's disappearance lingered like an unsolved riddle that taunted investigators in Ashford. Detectives had combed through her apartment dozens of times, revisiting every crevice of the locked room that had made her case infamous. They interviewed friends, neighbors, and co-workers, ran background checks, followed leads that fizzled out in the snow, and revisited timelines until the numbers blurred together. Yet for years, the evidence seemed to say nothing. But evidence is rarely silent. Sometimes, it only waits for the right moment and the right tools to speak. In the early 2000s, forensic science was still limited. DNA technology had already reshaped criminal investigations, but its sensitivity wasn't what it would become. Partial profiles often yielded inconclusive results, and trace evidence that couldn't be matched to a suspect languished in archives. Rachel's case had those very problems. The fibers collected from her jacket, the faint impressions of touch on a vent cover, and the microscopic samples sealed away in envelopes, all were examined, but none delivered the breakthrough detectives desperately sought. By 2006, Rachel's file had been reclassified as a cold case. It was one of hundreds across the state, names typed neatly on manila folders stacked in metal cabinets, each representing a life interrupted, a family without answers. For Rachel's parents, every anniversary was a reminder that her smile still stared out from missing posters while justice remained frozen, like the winter storm that had taken her. Still, her file was never forgotten. Detectives who rotated through the Ashford precinct passed the case down like a solemn inheritance. They told new recruits the story of the locked room, of the snow without footprints, of the girl who vanished into nothing. It was a reminder of humility, that not every question has an immediate answer. But it was also a quiet promise: someday, if the science caught up, they would try again. The Cold Case Division in Portland had begun reevaluating unsolved disappearances using next-generation forensic tools. Advances in touch DNA analysis and microtrace fiber comparison offered hope where before there had been only frustration. When Rachel Morgan's file crossed the desk of forensic analyst Dr. Emily Garner, she requested the original evidence packets. The evidence log revealed the same list investigators had seen years before: a jacket, a scarf, several fibers, a vent cover smudged with faint prints. To a casual eye, it was nothing new. But to Dr. Garner, who had spent years working with the latest equipment, it was a treasure chest waiting to be reopened. She began with the fibers. Under scanning electron microscopy, fibers could now be analyzed in ways unavailable in 2004. The jacket fibers showed tiny foreign strands, synthetic, coarse, unlike anything in Rachel's wardrobe. They were embedded with particles of dust common in crawlspaces and HVAC ducts. Dr. Garner compared them to known industrial samples and discovered a striking match: fibers used in the insulation of commercial air ducts manufactured in the 1990s. The significance was chilling. Rachel's jacket bore microscopic evidence from inside a ventilation system. Investigators returned to the original crime scene photographs, focusing on the basement vent cover that had seemed, at the time, only loosely connected to the case. No one had seriously considered that a full-grown man could have entered through it. But the fibers told a different story. Not only had someone entered through the vent, they had made direct contact with Rachel while she was still wearing her jacket. For the first time in years, detectives felt the pulse of a living lead. They began revisiting everyone who had lived within a 3-block radius of Rachel's apartment in 2004. Their eyes landed on one name, Daniel Whitaker. Daniel had never been a suspect in the early years. He had no criminal record, no violent incidents, nothing that screamed danger. He was the kind of man overlooked precisely because he seemed unremarkable. He had even participated in the search parties, blending into the crowd. But now, with new fiber evidence pointing to a knowledge of air ducts and ventilation systems, his profession as a heating and cooling technician loomed large. Investigators pulled his employment records and learned that in the months before Rachel's disappearance, Daniel had serviced several buildings in Ashford, including one adjacent to her apartment complex. He had access to equipment, tools, and the kind of specialized knowledge that could explain the loosened vent cover. The vent cover itself, stored carefully for years, became the next focus. With new methods, technicians were able to extract skin cells invisible to the naked eye. This technique, known as touch DNA, was far more advanced than anything available in 2004. The lab worked meticulously, swabbing edges and screws. What they found was a partial profile, faint, degraded, but enough to compare against modern databases. When entered into CODIS, it did not return a match. But when investigators obtained a court order for Daniel Whitaker's DNA, the results were undeniable. It wasn't absolute proof, but it was the missing link between the fibers, the vent, and Daniel's proximity to Rachel. As detectives revisited the evidence with fresh eyes, a picture began to form. Rachel had come home that night exhausted, heating up her dinner. Daniel, who had prepared the vent days earlier, used the blizzard as cover to slip into her apartment. The fibers from the ducts clung to Rachel's jacket during the encounter, a microscopic testimony to his presence. The vent bore the trace of his touch. Every piece that had once seemed insignificant now aligned with a chilling precision. Detectives didn't move immediately. They watched Daniel quietly, observing his routines. He still lived in Ashford, still worked odd jobs, still drove the same work van with its faded logo. To the community, he was still invisible. But the investigators now knew they were staring at the predator who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. By early 2021, investigators were ready. They summoned Daniel for an interview, under the pretense of routine questioning in a cold case review. At first, he maintained his mask of ordinariness, calm, polite, insisting he had nothing to do with Rachel's disappearance. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, the mask began to slip. The detectives didn't need a full confession that day. What mattered was that for the first time, the silence had broken. The evidence was no longer dormant. It had spoken, and it had pointed to the man next door. Rachel's case illustrates a truth that investigators across the world know well: evidence never really dies. It can wait decades in boxes, sealed away in basements, until science develops the ability to hear what it has been saying all along. For Rachel's family, the moment was bittersweet. 17 years had passed. 17 years of birthdays missed, of holidays spent with an empty chair. But at last, there was movement, a sense that justice was stirring. And for the town of Ashford, the revelation was both shocking and sobering. The helpful neighbor who had joined the search, who had carried candles at vigils, was no longer just Daniel the repairman. He was Daniel the suspect, Daniel the predator, Daniel whose ordinary life had been a disguise. The evidence had spoken. Now, the trial of truth would begin. When investigators finally closed in on Daniel Whitaker years after Rachel Morgan's disappearance, what unsettled them most was not just the crime itself but the psychology of the man who had hidden in plain sight for so long. To neighbors he was the ordinary technician, the quiet man next door you called when the furnace rattled in the middle of January, courteous and unremarkable, the type of man who blended into the edges of community life. Yet, as detectives and psychologists unraveled his past, a chilling portrait took shape, not of an obvious monster, but of a deeply fractured man whose entire existence was governed by an obsession with control. His childhood had been soaked in fear. A father who drank heavily ruled their small home with fists and shouting, a figure whose mood swung like a pendulum from silence to violence. His mother offered no shield, retreating inward, her quietness teaching young Daniel a harsh lesson that survival meant submission. In such an atmosphere, the boy absorbed a single truth: the only way to be safe was to hold power, to dictate the rules before someone else dictated them to you. By adolescence, he had become adept at compartmentalizing. At school he was polite, easy to overlook, the boy who vanished into the crowd. At home he learned to read the air, to anticipate his father's rage, to adapt his behavior in order to dodge a blow or an insult. While some who endure such trauma develop empathy, Daniel moved in the opposite direction. He developed a fixation on never being powerless again. Machines gave him the sense of mastery people denied him. Radios, furnaces, air conditioners, they were reliable, predictable, controllable. When a motor whirred back to life under his hand, it was a small victory that reassured him that something in the world would obey. Unlike people, machines never laughed at him, never humiliated him, never ignored his presence. This growing obsession with mechanical obedience shaped how he viewed human beings. To Daniel, people became puzzles that should function with the same predictability as the appliances he repaired. When they did not, when they rejected him, ridiculed him, or treated him as insignificant, he felt they were broken mechanisms he had the right to correct. By adulthood, Daniel had perfected a mask of reliability. He appeared courteous, always ready to lend a hand, never drawing suspicion. When Rachel Morgan disappeared, he joined the search parties, trudging through snow with flashlights, calling her name alongside neighbors. On the surface, he looked like a concerned member of the community. In reality, it was an act, a calculated performance. Psychologists would later call this duplicitous social functioning, the predator cloaking himself in normalcy to deflect suspicion. He had learned early that the most effective predator was not the one hiding in the shadows, but the one who stood among you, invisible precisely because he looked so ordinary. Control ran like a thread through every part of his life. He fixed neighbors' heaters not from kindness but because it granted him access to their homes, to their floor plans, to details about locks and doors and vulnerabilities no one else thought to guard. Rachel Morgan, with her youth, independence, and bright trajectory, embodied everything he could not control. While she studied to become a healer, he remained a solitary man in an inherited house, without recognition or family, his life stagnant. What began as curiosity toward her transformed into resentment, and eventually, into an obsession that he rehearsed meticulously. Watching her was never about affection. It was about practice. He tracked her routines, noted her comings and goings, and envisioned how he could impose himself into her world. Criminal psychologists often say predators rehearse before they act, running scenarios in their minds, escalating their intrusions. Daniel had a unique advantage: his technical skills. To him, a vent was not simply part of a wall, it was a hidden doorway. Investigators later found the vent in Rachel's basement tampered with days before her disappearance, proof that Daniel's crime was not a sudden impulse but the product of careful rehearsal and patient obsession. What chilled investigators even more was how calmly he compartmentalized afterward. The morning after Rachel vanished, he returned to work as though nothing had happened. He smiled at clients, shopped for groceries, sat at the diner like he always did. At vigils held in Rachel's memory, he lowered his eyes in solemn silence, blending into the grieving crowd. For 17 years he carried this secret without cracking, sustained by a narcissistic detachment that convinced him he was smarter than everyone else. Each year the case went unsolved only inflated his sense of superiority, his belief that he had outwitted time and justice. Yet, the echoes of his childhood still reverberated in everything he did. He had inherited his father's need for domination, only Daniel wielded his control through stealth rather than fists. His father's violence was loud and explosive, Daniel's was silent, insidious, hidden beneath smiles and polite gestures. Rachel's fate was never about lust or sudden rage, it was about control, the same control he had craved since childhood. In his distorted mind, Rachel ceased to exist as a daughter, a friend, a student. She became an object, a piece in his twisted play where he alone dictated the rules. For years, no one suspected the man next door, and that was precisely the point. His psychology thrived on proximity. He didn't want to inspire fear, he wanted to be trusted. He craved the power that came from being overlooked, from standing in plain sight and knowing no one questioned him. Neighbors remembered in hindsight odd little details, how his demeanor stiffened when Rachel's name came up, how he sometimes seemed too eager to help. At the time, they meant nothing. Only later, illuminated by forensic evidence, did those cracks in his mask reveal the predator underneath. Technology eventually caught up to him. Trace fibers, microscopic DNA, evidence invisible in 2004, finally exposed the truth. The mask Daniel had worn for nearly 2 decades fractured under the weight of science and persistence. The revelation devastated Ashford, not only because of Rachel's tragic fate but because of the betrayal of trust. People realized they had let him into their homes, had handed him their keys, had spoken casually with him while he carried within him the darkest of secrets. In the end, Daniel Whitaker was not extraordinary in his pathology. His psychology was a familiar pattern, a childhood of abuse, a fixation on control, a mask of normalcy, and an escalation toward domination. What made him haunting was his patience, his ability to sustain the performance of normalcy for 17 long years. To study him is to confront the danger of the ordinary, the unsettling truth that the most dangerous predators are not always the figures lurking in the shadows, but the men in work boots and tool belts, smiling politely as they hold the door open. His mind was a cage built long before Rachel Morgan ever crossed his path. She was not chosen for who she was, but for what she represented, the perfect canvas for him to act out the control he had been rehearsing his entire life. And in that reality lies the most chilling truth of all: sometimes evil is not a stranger, but the neighbor you thought you knew, the one who waits patiently for the world to mistake silence for innocence. For years the disappearance of Rachel Morgan remained a wound that never healed in Ashford. Flyers yellowed on bulletin boards, her face became a faded memory in the post office window, and every anniversary passed with the same unanswered question: where did she go? Detectives retired, files changed hands, and tips arrived like dying embers, glowing briefly before fading into nothing. The town's hope dimmed with each year, but the case was never forgotten. It lived in storage boxes marked with her name, in photographs stacked inside binders, and in the gnawing determination of investigators who refused to call it hopeless. The first real breakthrough came not from sudden confession or chance encounter, but from the slow march of science. In the early 2000s, forensic tools could not read what the human eye overlooked. Trace fibers, microscopic skin cells, the smallest fragments of hair, these were invisible back then, evidence collected and stored but not yet understood. By 2020, the rules had changed. Laboratories could now extract complete DNA profiles from samples once deemed too degraded. What had been silent for nearly 2 decades suddenly had a voice. Inside one of those old boxes, carefully sealed and labeled, was a vent cover from Rachel's basement. It had been removed by investigators only days after she vanished, its screws loose in a way that suggested tampering. At the time, it was bagged, tagged, and logged as routine procedure. No one believed it would ever amount to anything. But 2 decades later, a new forensic team unwrapped it and went to work. Under powerful microscopes and chemical processing, they found it, a partial skin cell fragment lodged beneath the metal edge, undisturbed for 17 years. That sliver of biology would become the thread that unraveled everything. When the lab report came back, the name attached to the DNA sent ripples through the task force: Daniel Whitaker. To some, it was almost unbelievable. Daniel had been there all along, the quiet technician who fixed boilers, the man who lived 3 blocks from Rachel's family, the volunteer who carried a flashlight during those frantic first nights of searching. He had no criminal record, no violent history, nothing that screamed predator. But the science was unflinching. His DNA was on the vent cover inside the Morgan home, in a place he had no legitimate reason to be. Still, detectives knew science alone would not be enough. Defense attorneys could argue contamination or question the chain of custody. To bring down Daniel Whitaker, they needed more: a pattern, a motive, a history that connected him unmistakably to Rachel's fate. And so the real work began. Investigators combed through his life with fresh eyes. Old service records showed he had been called to the Morgan residence once, months before Rachel disappeared, to fix a malfunctioning furnace. That gave him legitimate entry into the house, but it also gave him knowledge, the layout of the basement, the positioning of vents, the location of locks. Neighbors were re-interviewed, and memories resurfaced. One recalled seeing Daniel's van idling on the street near Rachel's home late at night, though she had dismissed it at the time as routine work. Another remembered how Daniel grew strangely quiet whenever Rachel's name was mentioned in the years afterward, his eyes darting away as though even hearing it was uncomfortable. The task force also pulled Daniel's financial and employment records. They found an unusual gap, 3 days off work unaccounted for in the very week Rachel disappeared. When questioned back then, he had explained it away as illness. But with hindsight, and against the weight of new evidence, the absence seemed more deliberate, more calculated. Psychological profilers revisited his history. They traced back to his childhood, the violence he endured from his father, the silence of his mother, the refuge he found in machines. To the profilers, this was not random. This was the blueprint of a man who equated control with safety. Rachel had become the canvas upon which he enacted that need for dominance. Every detail, the surveillance of her schedule, the tampering with her basement vent, the timing of her disappearance, fit his pattern. But perhaps the most damning detail came from a discovery made in his garage when investigators secured a warrant. Among shelves of tools and spare parts was a small box of personal items. Inside were objects that seemed ordinary at first, a scarf, a bracelet, and a hairpin. Each was sealed in a plastic bag, meticulously labeled with dates. One of those items matched a description from Rachel's parents, her missing bracelet, a birthday gift she wore every day until the night she disappeared. To law enforcement, this was not just evidence of possession. It was evidence of ritual. Daniel had kept trophies, reminders of his control, hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The arrest, when it came, was quiet. Daniel Whitaker was taken from his modest house without resistance, the same house where he had lived since childhood. Neighbors watched from their porches in disbelief, whispering to one another as the man they had trusted was led away in handcuffs. For years he had been the one they called for help, the one who smiled politely in the grocery store, the one who shook their hands at town meetings. Now he was the prime suspect in a case that had haunted them for a generation. Inside the interrogation room, Daniel maintained his calm. He denied everything, insisting the DNA was a mistake, the bracelet a coincidence. His voice never rose, his demeanor never cracked. But detectives knew better. They had seen this mask before. It was the same mask he wore when he walked with neighbors during the search, when he sat silently at vigils, when he laughed lightly over coffee at the diner. Behind the calm was a man who believed he could outsmart the system. But this time, the system had caught up. Prosecutors built their case meticulously. They presented the DNA on the vent cover, the bracelet in his garage, the service record that placed him in Rachel's home. They detailed the psychological profile that linked his need for control to the crime. Piece by piece, they assembled a portrait not just of opportunity, but of obsession. It was not a story of chance, it was a story of design. When the case finally went to trial, the courtroom was packed. Rachel's family sat in the front row, holding hands, bracing for the details they had feared but needed to hear. Former neighbors filled the benches, their expressions a mix of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. And at the defense table sat Daniel Whitaker, expressionless, his hands folded neatly as if he were waiting for a furnace repair appointment. But this was no routine call. This was the reckoning. The breakthrough in Rachel Morgan's case was not a sudden miracle. It was the result of persistence, of evidence stored when it seemed useless, of science advancing to catch what once slipped away. It was a reminder that silence does not erase truth, that even after 17 years, the smallest fragment can speak louder than any lie. For Ashford, it was the moment when the unanswered question finally began to unravel. For Rachel's family, it was the moment when hope and grief collided, when the long shadow of uncertainty gave way to the painful light of truth. And for investigators, it was proof of something they had always believed: no mask lasts forever. The trial of Daniel Whitaker began on a gray morning in the county courthouse, the kind of place that had seen decades of land disputes, theft cases, and custody battles, but never a crime that had carried the weight of an entire community's grief. By the time the proceedings opened, Ashford had already lived nearly 2 decades in the shadow of Rachel Morgan's disappearance, and now every street, every diner booth, every pew in town seemed to carry whispers of the case. People had grown old waiting for this day. Parents who once feared for their daughters had since become grandparents, but the raw wound of uncertainty still lingered. When the charges were finally read, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and first-degree murder, the courtroom became not just a place of law, but a stage on which the town's faith in justice was to be tested. From the very first moment, the prosecution built its case around 2 central themes: evidence and deception. They spoke not only of the microscopic fibers and traces of DNA recovered from the tampered vent in Rachel's basement, but also of the years Daniel had spent presenting himself as a trustworthy neighbor. The prosecutors described him as a man who smiled while carrying secrets, a man who volunteered in search parties he knew would never succeed. They framed him as someone who thrived on proximity to grief, who walked among the brokenhearted with the calm of someone certain he would never be caught. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary citizens, watched him closely, searching for signs of the predator described to them. But Daniel sat quietly, his face unreadable, his posture careful, his hands folded neatly on the table. The defense attempted to counter this image with a familiar strategy, dismantling the reliability of memory and casting doubt on the evidence. They emphasized the length of time that had passed since Rachel vanished. 17 years, they reminded the jury, was enough for recollections to fade, for physical evidence to degrade, for false leads to entangle themselves with reality. They painted Daniel as a scapegoat chosen because the town needed closure, not because proof demanded it. His attorney argued that the fibers, the DNA, the so-called trophies found in his garage were circumstantial, artifacts of coincidence or contamination. He urged the jurors not to mistake suspicion for certainty. The testimonies of Rachel's family proved to be some of the most heart-wrenching moments of the trial. Her mother spoke in a trembling voice of the last time she saw her daughter, recalling the sound of Rachel's laughter in the kitchen, the unfinished cup of tea on the counter. Her father, more stoic but no less broken, recounted years spent searching fields, riverbanks, and abandoned barns, always with a fragment of hope he could never quite extinguish. They did not need to dramatize their pain, the weight of it filled the room with silence. Many jurors later admitted that those testimonies were among the hardest moments they had ever endured. But it was not only emotion that the prosecution leaned on, it was science. Advances in forensic analysis had transformed what was once inconclusive into damning evidence. A swab taken from the vent cover, carefully preserved and re-examined with modern technology, revealed a partial genetic profile that matched Daniel Whitaker. The odds of it belonging to someone else were astronomically low. Alongside this, investigators had uncovered a small cache of belongings in Daniel's garage, objects seemingly insignificant in isolation, but chilling in context. A scarf, a bracelet, a set of house keys. Items Rachel's friends confirmed had belonged to her. The defense suggested contamination or mistaken identification, but the prosecution asked the jury to consider the probability of so many coincidences aligning in one man's possession. Witnesses also testified to Daniel's strange behavior over the years. A former neighbor recalled how he once grew tense when Rachel's name was mentioned, his jaw tightening as though he had been struck. Another described how Daniel had insisted on helping repair her basement furnace without charge, lingering longer than necessary, his eyes moving across the room in a way she only later found unsettling. At the time, she thought of him as simply thorough. In hindsight, she wondered if he had been rehearsing again, walking through another's home as though it were a puzzle waiting to be solved. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day drawing new lines between the ordinary and the unthinkable. Journalists filled the benches, their notes capturing the clash of arguments, the tears of witnesses, the occasional slip of frustration from lawyers on both sides. The community watched with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that no verdict could undo Rachel's fate but desperate for the truth to be formally recognized. When Daniel himself finally chose to testify, the courtroom leaned forward collectively. His voice was calm, his tone measured, almost eerily detached. He denied everything, claiming he had been framed, that evidence had been mishandled, that his reputation as a solitary man had been twisted into something sinister. He described himself as misunderstood, a private individual victimized by gossip and overzealous investigators. Some jurors later confessed that his testimony chilled them not because it was convincing, but because of how devoid of emotion it seemed. It was as though the disappearance of a young woman was not a human tragedy to him, but an inconvenience in his otherwise orderly life. The closing arguments crystallized the essence of the trial. The prosecution asked the jurors to weigh not only the scientific evidence but also the pattern of behavior, the control, the deception, the hidden trophies. They spoke of Rachel not as a symbol but as a daughter, a student, a friend whose life had been stolen by a man who viewed people as machines to be taken apart and silenced. The defense countered with appeals to doubt, urging the jury not to convict on the basis of suspicion amplified by grief. They reminded them that the law demanded certainty beyond reasonable doubt, and that sentiment, no matter how powerful, could not substitute for proof. The deliberations lasted 2 full days. Inside the jury room, men and women argued over the weight of fibers, the interpretation of behavior, the reliability of memory. Some initially wavered, unsettled by the time that had passed and the lack of a body. Others insisted the combination of evidence painted a picture too clear to ignore. Eventually, consensus was reached. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Families held hands, reporters adjusted their pens, and Daniel stared straight ahead, his expression unchanged. The foreperson's voice was steady as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. For the first time in 17 years, the silence surrounding Rachel's disappearance broke into a sound of collective release. Her mother wept openly, clutching her husband's hand. Friends embraced, some crying, some simply staring in stunned quiet. The judge thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the weight of their decision, and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Daniel Whitaker showed no visible reaction. He did not flinch, did not protest, did not hang his head. He remained as he had always been, controlled, composed, a man who seemed to believe he was still holding some hidden advantage. But this time, the system had caught up with him. The mask had finally shattered under the relentless persistence of time, science, and memory. In the weeks that followed, Ashford slowly began to exhale. It was not closure, Rachel's absence could never be filled, but it was recognition. The trial had validated what so many had felt in their bones for years, that trust had been betrayed by a man who lived among them, and that justice, however delayed, was still possible. The verdict did not erase the tragedy, but it restored something essential, the belief that truth, even when buried for nearly 2 decades, can still emerge into the light.